celebration of World FTD Awareness Week. My name is Danielle Harvey, and I am part of the Elector Medical Affairs team. As many of you know, World FTD Awareness Week will be celebrated September 26th through October 3rd and is a global event held annually to raise awareness for frontotemporal dementia. This year, World FTD United has invited individuals worldwide to join in a conversation on FTD. As the first company running a phase 3 clinical trial for FTD and testing a disease-modifying treatment, Elector has come to appreciate how challenging an FTD diagnosis is to live with, as well as to obtain an accurate and early diagnosis. At Elector, we know there is much more work to be done to raise awareness about persons diagnosed with FTD and their family journey. With that goal in mind, Elector has invited 3 individuals to talk about their relationship with FTD and to engage in a discussion about person-centric care for FTD. As we are in a virtual setting, I will introduce each panelist and ask 2 questions that will help us understand their individual experiences with FTD, and then invite all participants to engage in a group discussion on person-centric care. So with that, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Deb Sharper. Deb is the AFTD ambassador for the state of Iowa and is also a care partner for a person living with FTD. So welcome, Deb, and thank you for your participation in today's conversation.
Yes, I first want to thank you guys for inviting me to be on this panel. And I want you to know, when I share my story and my journey, this is just my story, and everybody has their own different journey. My purpose in life now is to bring awareness and to help families going through this storm. This is the only way that I have to fight back against FTD that currently has no cure. At this stage in my loved one's life, all I can do is watch his decline and meet him where he's at in the moment. This disease has brought so many heartache and so many unknowns to our family. The impact has changed my outlook on life. I want to give you a little glimpse into my life and my world. We started out in high school. We were high school sweethearts at the age of 16, and we started dating in 1989. Then we'll fast forward quite a few years. We got married, finished college, have 2 amazing children. And as you know, how those days go fast and the nights even faster trying to get the kids down. What happened next was in 2004, we've decided that we wanted to own and operate a car repair business. My husband was an amazing mechanic. The first few years of owning this business, it went great, no problems whatsoever. But as the years went on, I began seeing a decline in work ethic and the ability to get him organized and for him to complete the jobs for the day. In 2008 is a milestone that I'll never forget. I came to the shop and he told me with fear in his eyes, "Deb, I opened up the car hood and I don't know how to fix it." And that is also when we really talked about, maybe it was the stress. We didn't know what was going on. Something had changed and we had to figure it out. And he was only 38 years old at the time. And we made the decision to cut our losses before we would be in debt even more. During this time, I also noticed a decline in his passions. He stopped competing in demolition derbies. He also secluded himself in the house. He had this 65 Impala that he loved to drive. He wouldn't go do that any longer. So it was just not the same man that I married. Jump ahead now to spring of 2012. He was in and out of several different jobs. And with one hospital stay, we had to try and fix some paranoid episodes that he was having, and the physicians gave him medicine to control his thoughts. Now we're at the working second shift at a factory. And at this point, I had to call him every single day to make sure he was up, make sure that he was showered, ate, and then I would call back later in the afternoon to make sure that I got him to work on time. The meds just were not helping, and it was actually making him worse. And so then I reached out to Mayo Clinic and asked for some more appointments that I could get him. Then October 2nd, 2012, I was called by his employer that he didn't show up for work. I was frantic. I went home and I arrived to a Dear Deb letter. He was so distraught and just knew something was not right with him. He tried to cut his wrists. At that point, I caught him in time, which is absolutely amazing. We got him to Rochester, and then we started our journey of getting the therapies and having the testing done to see what was actually wrong with him. At that point, Mayo Clinic told us that was probably severe depression, and what they recommended was 9 episodes of ECT treatments, which is electrical shock therapy. So we'd have to live up there for 4 weeks and get this therapy done. After it was done, he came home and we did see a difference in him. He seemed to have a little more pep in his step. He'd smile a little bit more. So we thought, oh, this is it. We got it to go. He got another job then back in the auto business. So we thought for sure that this would be actually what he needed. Loved mechanics. So we thought this is going to be perfect. 6 months into him working there, he got into an altercation. And this definitely was not Tommy. Tommy never would fight with anybody. We were once again without a job, and the cycle was starting to become our normal. At this time, he was out of a job for 8 months. And the concentration level for him was so hard. You'd have to fill out applications. You'd have to go onto the computer and do your unemployment. And each week it got harder and harder for him. And he would even at times not even put in for unemployment benefits because he couldn't figure out how to do it on the computer. March of 2015, he finally found another job, but it will be his last job. He was a package delivery man. As the weeks went on, I would hear stories of paranoia, and he was getting lost driving. He was telling me that he couldn't use his phone to figure out where the packages would go. He told me he couldn't have the radio on and that they were videotaping him. We would stay up late at night in the evenings trying to help him read the maps, trying to help him learn the policy and procedures. He was obsessed at every single detail. It was consuming him. I cannot imagine what he was going through. For the first time in his life, he couldn't read a map and he couldn't figure out how to use a computer. March 20th, we had him evaluated again at a physician's office because he thought that I was poisoning him. He thought that I was doing this to him. And that's where we began the testing of the cognitive thinking and CT and MRIs. I started to do tons and tons of research on the internet, typing in as much as I could of what symptoms Tommy had and what was going on. And all of a sudden, Pick's disease comes up on my computer. And that used to be what FTD is called now. It was Pick's disease. And every single thing on that list was going to what Tommy was going through. And I brought that to the physician. I said, do you think this could be it? And the physician stated, yep, I do believe it is. And so then we were sent to Rochester and they did finally make the diagnosis. And all that they told us was, you need to go home. You need to get help in your house to be able to let him stay at home. And we needed to get our affairs in order. Meaning we had to make sure that we had our POAs, our living wills, and all of our financials ready to go. That is so devastating. I can't even tell you what it's like to hear at the age of 44, get your stuff together. We didn't even at that time think of having nursing home insurance at all. In your 30s, you don't think about buying it at that point. Then April 1st and 2nd, we had some very severe behaviors. I set up a doctor's appointment the next morning and to see what the doctor could do to help me be able to control his behavioral issues at home. So he gave me some medicine. Needless to say, that didn't help. So that evening, my loved one was admitted into the hospital, and that's in early May. And that's where the journey of nursing home care at the young of the age of 44 began. I am so thankful for AFTD for bringing awareness to FTD. What an association to get the word out and to help the young families that are dealing with this. If I had gotten the diagnosis sooner, I could have made his life the last few years living with us amazing. You didn't mean to get mad at him when he couldn't figure out the computer, but you didn't understand why he couldn't. And so I could have met him at his spot and we could have made a less stressful environment for him, let him, have a better home life. During that time, the kids and I started trying to find some support groups that we could be part of. And we tried first an Alzheimer's Association one. It was absolutely wonderful, but the group that we were in were elderly. And it was like older adults doing their fathers and their mothers. Well, this was totally different. We were in our 40s. And so then I jumped on and I found AFTD and reached out to the volunteer coordinator, and I jumped in with both feet. We had no young onset dementia support groups in our area. Within a year, we got one down in Des Moines started, and we have one in northern Iowa. I'm honored to say that I went from a local volunteer to a support group facilitator to a volunteer regional coordinator. Today, my role in AFTD is Iowa AFTD ambassador and facilitating a support group in northern Iowa. The kids and I have also created an annual golf tournament for fundraising. We call it the Crusade for a Cure. We just ended up doing our 5th year of the event. And I'm so proud to say that we have almost raised more than $40,000 in 5 years, and we donate all to AFTD and for research. I have to thank AFTD organization. It has found my passion along with my saving grace that I can put my energy into something and make a difference.
Deb, thank you so much for sharing your personal relationship with FTD. There was so much there that you shared with us, and I really appreciate you being so candid in what you shared. When we think about World FTD United and FTD Awareness Week, I'm curious, as a care partner, what personal message you would like to add to the worldwide conversation. Is there a special message that you want to share with everyone on the call today and as being part of World FTD Awareness Week?
The number one thing that I want to stress is we have to help and find nursing homes and memory units that will accept young patients. This is one of my missions, to bring awareness and needing options for our young loved ones. We need to investigate ways to providing nursing home and memory units that will accept young patients. In my state of Iowa, many nursing homes do not accept anyone under the age of 65 due to regulations and different activities they must furnish for the resident. Then once you get done completing the spend down and qualify for state care, which is Medicaid in my state, the reimbursement funding is so bad that nursing homes and memory units limit the amount of Medicaid beds open. This cuts the family's options, I would say tenfold, trying to find a facility for anyone under the age of 65. Then you have to remember with FTD, you have the behavioral aspect on it. So if you have any thing with behavioral on your medical records, that's going to cut even more time away from you that you can't get into a home. At the age of 44, my loved one needed some more help. I became the sole provider of family of 4 and with the health insurance. So it was not an option that I could stay home to take care of him. We need to look for more ways that we can get home health aides and more companies out there that will come into the home and help us be able to keep these loved ones with us longer. Our adventure in the hospital and nursing home shuffle began, and we have been in 4 different nursing homes in the last 6 years. April 2015, after the tests were done and we were diagnosed, it took 45 days for my loved one to find a place that he could go. So he had to stay in a hospital on this psychiatric ward for 45 days. And you have to remember, dementia is so different than other mental health that he's in and out with people that are maybe on drugs and things in that nature. And so it made his paranoia and his behaviorals even worse because people were coming in and out so many times that he would get used to somebody and then they'd be gone. We finally found a facility that would accept us. The only bad thing was it wasn't a locked unit. And at the age of 44, can you imagine not knowing that, why can't I go outside? The door's open, I'm going out. And so he kept on setting off alarms. And so they only let us stay there about 15 days. And they gave me the papers that I had to be discharged. And I had a limited amount of time to find another facility for him. We were lucky enough that I did find one, and it was 30 minutes from our house. He was there from 2015 till 2017. Then we were also then asked to let go. The downside is where he's placed is all elderly people. There's no young ones for him to see every day. He was closer to the nurses' age than what the residents were. And they didn't understand that he wasn't going to go to bed at 8 o'clock at night. He wanted to pace. He wanted to stay up. He didn't care that everybody else was in bed. He wanted to watch TV. And so it caused some issues with that end of it. Let me bring you into a little bit of a perspective of what FTD world is for my loved one. Close your eyes and let me put you into the world of my loved one. One day he lives at a home with 7 acres of land. He's got a big shed with all of his tools and cars and to tinker with and all the supplies he would need. Then the next day he's locked in a hallway with dim lights and the smells that he never knew existed. And he's surrounded by all elderly residents. That are mostly all wheelchair bound. Now add the medications that they're giving him to try and keep him from stop walking or getting into people's things. He was so over medicated. Early on the disease, he was able to communicate with me, and we wrote in the diaries every day when I went to visit, and he told me that he felt like a caged animal, that he would be treated better in jail than in this nursing home. At times, I would have to agree. At least he would be able to go outside in the courtyard, play with the basketball, he could get some exercise, but no, he was in a locked hallway. My dream is to have facilities built that can cater to handle our young patients. July of 2017, due to some other behaviors in this facility, my loved one was taken to the hospital again, and with discharge papers. We were homeless for 24 hours. The nursing home wouldn't take us. The hospital wouldn't take us. So we had to sit in a room waiting to see where we were going to go. Finally, the hospital did say that they would give us a room until we could find a facility for him. Then July 26th, I got a phone call that only one facility in the whole state of Iowa would try and help us. That was 3 hours away. We had no choice. This is where we had to go. I'm very blessed that they did accept him, but what I'm going to tell you is the facility that we got sent to, can't even explain. It was like the Twilight Zone. I knew that this is where we had to go, but it wasn't the right spot. Then they told me finally after 6 months, if he had no incidences at this facility, I could start calling around to other nursing homes. And I'm so blessed that he did really good there. And we got a nursing home that is now only 2.5 hours away from us. And they treat him very well. It's not perfect. Of course, no one's going to be perfect. Us caregivers, we think we can do better than anybody else. But I know this is a good place for him. To this day, I travel 1 weekend a month, FaceTime him weekly, and make phone calls. Whenever he needs me, he contacts me. And his mother travels another weekend out of the month. When COVID hit, this was detrimental to Tommy. He was taken away from us. We couldn't see him for a whole year. And, other nursing home patients, you could go and look outside the window and talk to them and stuff and have communication that way. There was no way I could travel to do that to him. That would confuse him anymore. And I don't know what would have happened. He didn't understand why I would be outside that window and not in with him. So now he's nonverbal. He's lost tons of weight and he has more of a shuffle than ever, but it's just because I don't think he had the human contact and he didn't have his family around him. We're at a stage now that I'm trying to get him closer to home. I'm desperately calling and reapplying to other facilities closer to home. I'm looking in southern Minnesota and northern Iowa. The memory units, the ones that I'm calling now are saying, yep, we'll let you have Medicaid payments, but you have to pay 2 years out of pocket before we'll accept you to be able to have the Medicaid payment. I've already done the 2 years. I've already taken all of his retirement, half of my retirement. We've done the spend down. I can't afford to do another $7,000 a month to be able to let him live closer to us. The last thing I want to express to families, social workers, CNAs, and nurses, and all care partners and physicians, we have to listen and we have to give our loved ones the best quality of life. Remember, once we're diagnosed with FTD, it's not quantity of life anymore, it's quality. We need to change and we need to do what we can to advocate for our loved ones. If you feel deep in your soul this facility is not good and it's not going well, you need to start knocking on other doors. I feel so strongly that we need to make a change for our young adults. That last year I actually tried to become District 26 Senate candidate here in our district. And my whole platform for that campaign was improving access to affordable health care for all Iowans, and also increase access to mental health services and addressing the serious problems that we have with our Iowa privatized Medicaid. I didn't get that part. I got 30% of the votes, which I'm very happy about, but I know that God has a different path for me. And I just want to make my voice strong for all these families that are not being able to find places for their loved ones.
Thank you, Deb. I think one thing I'd like to share with you is that we so appreciate you sharing your personal relationship with FTD and your journey. I really honestly believe that the more we understand each family's individual journey, the better we can help individuals diagnosed with FTD and their families. So thank you so much. So now I'd like to invite our second panelist, Jamie Fong, to offer her unique perspective on FTD. Jamie is a genetic counselor and clinical faculty at Baylor University and a per diem genetic counselor at UCSF. So welcome, Jamie, to our conversation today. So as Deb shared with us her relationship with FTD, I would like to ask you, in celebration of World FTD Awareness Week, to share with the group your relationship with FTD.
Thank you, Danielle and Elector, for this invitation to speak. And Deb, I am truly moved by your story. Thank you for sharing. I wanted to say that I'm a genetic counselor. I work with people and who have a risk for frontotemporal dementia. For people with frontotemporal dementia and for asymptomatic people at risk, I engage them in conversations about the pros, cons, limitations of testing, while attempting to help them begin to adapt to receipt of genetic information. If people wish to pursue testing, I help facilitate the process. And I also disclose and interpret genetic test results. I make every effort to counsel people and care partners about how best to communicate genetic results with others in the family. And finally, I have an opportunity to moderate a monthly telephone support group for adult children of people with frontotemporal dementia. I've done that for the last 10 years, and I have to say it's been one of the most rewarding parts of what I do.
So Jamie, in addition to World FTD Awareness United asking care partners and persons diagnosed with FTD to be part of the conversation during FTD Awareness Week, they're also asking healthcare professionals to share their experiences with FTD. So as a genetic counselor, do you have a special message that you would like to add to this conversation we're having today?
Yeah, so certainly genetics is at the forefront of my thinking. And so I just wanted to share with folks that the landscape of frontotemporal dementia genetic testing is changing and changing rapidly. It is no longer only readily available in the research domain. In the clinical setting, Medicare may still not guarantee coverage of the cost of dementia testing. There are more and more opportunities for people with FTD to obtain testing without having to rely on Medicare or commercial insurance. Most instances of FTD are not purely genetic, and wider availability of FTD genetic testing could give more families peace of mind by ruling out a genetic form. And by the same token, for the 1 in 5 families facing a genetic form of FTD, genetic testing could identify the cause and could open up therapeutic trial opportunities for the person with the diagnosis. Of course, genetic testing can also inform other family members at risk. So, yeah, that's something I want families to keep in mind as we celebrate FTD awareness.
Well, thank you, Jamie, for sharing your experience with FTD. Now I'd like to invite our third and final panelist, Matt Sharp, to join our conversation. Matt is the AFTD Advocacy Manager, responsible for the coordination and development of AFTD advocacy activities. Welcome, Matt, to our conversation. We appreciate you being here today. What we'd like to hear from you is, what is your relationship with FTD?
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And thank you, Jamie and Deb, for sharing your experiences too. My relationship with FTD started about a little over 10 years ago in 2009. I was finishing up a master's program in social work with a concentration in social law and policy. When my father-in-law was diagnosed with FTD at the University of Pennsylvania's FTD Center. He was not the typical FTD patient in that he was already 79 years old, but he presented with behavioral symptoms of FTD. My mother-in-law, who was also a social worker by profession, got more involved with AFTD after the diagnosis and with the Penn FTD Center. She actually took over a caregiver support group that was originally started by AFTD's founder, Helen Ann Comstock. And shortly after I finished my master's program, a program coordinator position came open at AFTD. It seemed like a great opportunity for me to use what I had learned about social law and policy on behalf of my family member, to do what I could to make his experience as quality as possible. I was actually the fourth full-time employee of AFTD, along with Susan Dickinson, our executive director, Sharon Denny, who is now the senior director of programs, and we had an office manager named Michelle at that time. It's dizzying to me to think back on that I was actually the fourth person, considering that we are now, I think, over 35 full-time staff members. So the growth of this organization has been phenomenal over the past decade. Through my time at AFTD, I did basically a little bit of everything, as you can imagine, with an organization of 4 people. But one of the constants has been our helpline, which is a toll-free phone number and email address where people can contact AFTD with basically any conceivable question about the disease and caring for a loved one. In my time here, I've responded to thousands of cases, of helpline cases. Primarily, people contact us from within the United States, but we also have a lot of contact from Canada. And by email, we have international contact, so from people from around the world. Primarily it's care partners or family members that are reaching out to AFTD initially, but there's about 10 to 20% of the cases are from healthcare professionals or from people who are actually diagnosed with the disease. The questions are really quite diverse, actually. They kind of span the whole gamut, and there isn't any single predominant question. People call with concerns about themselves or a loved one who may have seen something about FTD somewhere and then, recognized the symptoms and were concerned for either themselves or a loved one and wanted to know where they could go to find more help and information and diagnosis if possible. We certainly get a lot of contacts from people who were recently given a diagnosis of FTD, often with very little additional information. Occasionally, the only thing people actually get is our helpline number, which is kind of scary if you think about that. But certainly appreciate the fact that there are neurologists out there who are directing people to us. Certainly people, contact up with questions about specific symptoms or specific treatments. We will do our best to answer, but always direct people to, appropriate medical help when necessary. We certainly get a lot of questions about the genetics of FTD, more and more so. As Jamie was saying, I think more people are becoming aware of the opportunities they have for genetic testing now. And it's a really complicated subject, for sure. So people often ask about that. And of course, community resources and especially residential care, like Deb was laying out. Residential care for people with FTD is so difficult to find. And honestly, it's one of the questions I dread the most because there just aren't good answers, as Deb's story really illustrated. It's a big issue for a lot of people. And we get a surprising number of calls about brain donation, even from morgue saying, we have this person's brain, we want to send it to you, what's your address? So it's always an interesting conversation. But over the past 4 to 6 years, I'd say we've been having an increasing number of contacts from people who are diagnosed. And for whatever reasons, they've got their own questions, trying to make plans for themselves, and also find meaningful ways to stay actively engaged. And I think it really does reflect the fact that there's a growing movement of people with dementia of all sorts who are really advocating for themselves. Too often we think of a diagnosis of dementia as sort of a ticket out of life, basically. And people have years and years of life left, often with many capabilities and competencies left. So it really is not a death sentence by any means. And too often people are just told, like you were, Deb, like, go get your affairs in order. It's time to get ready to pass away, essentially. But there is a growing number of people who just are not accepting that and demanding better. And this isn't just within the U.S. It's a global movement. And that has come to really inform AFTD's advocacy in many ways. In one way or the other, AFTD had been involved with advocacy efforts since the very beginning. A lot of it is actually focused on research funding for NIH through the federal budget. And one of the things I've been involved with throughout my time at AFTD is something called the National Alzheimer's Project, which is a federal effort to try and prepare the U.S. for all forms of dementia. It's called the Alzheimer's Project, but that's sort of a whole different conversation. But increasingly, an important focus is to try and help people with dementia participate in all of these efforts and all of these advocacy activities. And that includes engaging people with FTD in medical research, not just participation, but also trying to design trials in ways that actually make it possible for people to participate. And so it was just this July that I formally became the advocacy manager. So my life is no longer dictated by our helpline, which is something to get used to. And it's really an exciting opportunity to be able to, actually focus full time and devote our resources to this, because there's just so much that needs to be done.
So Matt, as the advocacy, manager, and I know that you said you just recently assumed that role, but clearly you've been involved a long time in FTD. What's your special message, or what would you like to share with our group and our listeners about World FTD Awareness Week? What's your personal message?
Well, I just want to emphasize the importance of early and accurate diagnosis. To finish the story with my father-in-law, after a couple of years of very little progression and continued evaluations, it was decided that he didn't actually have FTD. And I took it really as an important lesson on just how hard it is to diagnose this disease, even when you have access to, worldwide experts with all kinds of diagnostic tools available. It's still very possible to get this diagnosis wrong. But increasingly, there's a lot of advances in diagnostic abilities. Again, Alzheimer's is probably leading the way with this, and there are now blood biomarkers available in Alzheimer's, and that really portends a lot of hope for something similar in FTD. Early diagnosis, even in some cases pre-symptomatic diagnosis, creates all kinds of opportunities for individuals and families. Allows people to really fully participate in care planning and looking towards their future. It makes it possible to be proactive and to prevent the financial and legal harm that comes from undiagnosed FTD symptoms. And it increases people's ability to participate in advocacy and research, before progression makes those kinds of choices and activities more difficult. So I really do, think it's important that people become more aware of just, where the research in diagnostics is going and what hopefully is going to be possible in the not too distant future, because it's really going to it's going to be a game changer for everything, for advocacy, but also for research as well.
So I'm going to pass the virtual microphone to my colleague Nadine to lead us in our group discussion. Nadine.
Thank you, Danielle. And my name is Nadine Tatton, and I am the medical director for immunoneurology at Elector. And I just wanted to add that before I came to Elector, I was at AFTD for about 7 years as their scientific director. So I had the privilege to be able to participate in the annual education conferences and meet many of the families and persons diagnosed. And it was eye-opening, because when you're a scientist and you read about a disease in a textbook or a medical journal, it's nothing like the lived experience. So it was just a privilege to be there. I'm going to just talk about person-centric care, or sometimes industry calls that patient-centric care. Back in the 1980s, there was a researcher named Thomas Kitwood, and he was looking at how people in the dementia world were being treated in care facilities, in doctor's offices, at home. And he felt that there was a problem, because he realized that dementia is only a diagnosis and that there's so much more to a person than the diagnosis. And so he proposed a care approach that really worked to see the person's unique abilities and preferences, to anticipate the symptoms and challenges that were going to come along as they lost abilities. And some of this also was to encourage and empower the caregiver to understand that the person with dementia still would have beliefs and remaining abilities and life experiences and relationships that were important to them and contributed to who they are as a person. And I think, Deb, you highlighted this so well in sharing your story about Tommy and your experiences. You went from care facility to care facility. So I'm going to ask some questions. I'm going to start with Jamie first, because you're on the healthcare professional team. And before we had electronic medical health records and, so many things to fill in, so many different levels of insurance to look after, you didn't have that level of franticness of, I got to, check off this point, this point, this point, this point for the person. So as a genetic counselor, you have to have those difficult discussions with families about genetic testing. Do they want to get it? What's it going to be like? How will they deal with it? And what I wondered is, as we're trying to be more person-centric with FTD, do you ever have a conversation directly with the person who is diagnosed with FTD, or is it always with the caregiver or someone else?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always try to involve the person with the diagnosis as much as possible, certainly as long as the person can participate in the decision-making process. I think, to your point about one's personhood, I think there's a level of respect that we all want in terms of making decisions, certainly about medical procedures, tests, and it's important to give voice to the people whose lives are impacted so greatly by the medical test or procedure. I usually encourage the person with the diagnosis to include a support person in their genetic counseling consultation. The support person is usually a care partner or other family member or friend. If the person with the diagnosis is too impaired or would prefer that a family member or other individual kind of participate significantly in the consultation, I do ask that person be named, a proxy of sorts. I encourage that proxy to accompany the person with the diagnosis to the consultation, where I strive to achieve common ground between the proxy and the person with the diagnosis. Certainly, each person may come at the decision to test very differently, as it could impact their lives differently. Really only in extenuating circumstances would I hold a genetic counseling consultation with the proxy, in the absence of a person with the diagnosis.
Okay. Just as you touched on it, let's say the person does test positive for an FTD gene mutation, and then that has implications for the rest of the family. And some family members will choose to be tested, others will not. And that speaks to the fact that this is not a one and done conversation. Like, you've got the genetic test, you've confirmed the diagnosis, that's the box ticked on the medical record, but there's the rest of the family to consider. So I'm wondering, how do you continue on with the family? How many opportunities do you have for follow-up to just see them through the rest of these discussions and trying to understand and help them process this information and their choices coming ahead?
Yes, so I've always had the luxury of being able to work with other healthcare professionals, other providers who have regular follow-up, regular contact with the person with the diagnosis and their care partners. So this includes the physicians, the social workers, the nurses. And so in that respect, I am able to see persons with the diagnosis periodically on a more regular basis than I might otherwise. In the long run, I always remain available to the family as needed. Prior to result disclosure, as a person and their family is kind of walking through that decision to test, I am often in regular periodic contact with the person with the diagnosis or their care partner or family member, because that decision is not always a straightforward one. After result disclosure, I follow up with the family at least several times to check in. If there are family members at risk, I follow up to determine what plan, if any, is there to communicate results to others. We know that genetic information has huge implications for relatives. And at that time, I always let a family know that I'm available as the need arises.
So something that we had just touched on a previous conversation, you talked about a wraparound service, and I think you had mentioned it in relationship to schooling and getting little ones into the school system. But what would wraparound service mean for FTD and, from your perspective as a genetic counselor? Because for some neurologists, I think that diagnosis is, they've made the diagnosis, it's FTD, but for someone with the lived experience, that's just the beginning of the diagnosis. And that's the beginning of the journey, but it's not the end of FTD. So what would wraparound service look like?
Yeah, no, I think this is a great question. I think so often families feel that following a diagnosis, they are looking or hoping for more guidance, more support. And as you had mentioned, I was kind of encouraged by the kinds of wraparound services that are available in my geographic area's school district. But again, it takes this approach of a holistic one, understanding that it's not just the medical side of a diagnosis that a family may seek guidance about or want to work with others to navigate, but rather it's the day-to-day aspect of living with FTD. And so I would love to see clinics be affiliated with a kind of wraparound service where it would be staffed by social workers, nurses, other ancillary health professionals to guide, maybe identify resources. As I think about Deb's story and hearing about the difficulty and the long searches that Deb you've had to do, I'm wondering if there could have been someone to to help with that, whether to generate a list of potential facilities or to generate that list of phone numbers to call, right? Something that really just kind of takes a little bit of the edge off of the stress and the burden of providing care for loved ones with FTD.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hop over to Deb. You've been incredibly eloquent about Tommy's experience as the person with FTD, and you essentially provided his voice here. But I want to get your voice as the caregiver, because you've touched at other times on the fact that being a caregiver is fluid. So right now you're considering yourself as a care partner rather than a caregiver. And I'm wondering, like, how much do those roles change? Is there a third role mixed in with there as you were going through the FTD journey with your husband?
Yep. At the beginning, I was definitely the care partner, and we would talk about things that, like, let's try this med, let's do this. And we would talk about it. We'd agree together, this is what we needed to do. The day that I started having to call him to make sure he was up and eating and going to work on time, that's when I knew I was now the caregiver. And it was just very hard to think we're at this stage already. And now I call myself the care partner again, because I'm no longer giving him the care. I have to rely on the nursing home. I have to rely on the CNAs and the nursing staff to do what they need to do for him. I do help by any way that I can. Like, I have a list of information on his door, because you know what's so sad also is we cannot keep staff at nursing homes. So there's constant going in and out of different nurses, different CNAs. They don't know who my Tommy is. And so I have pictures all over in his room, along with picture books that they can go through and they can meet his family. And then I have a list of things that he used to do, what he likes, that he has a dog, and all those types of things, so that they can, like, have information about him, and also how to handle him a little bit. Sometimes he can get very agitated, and in our world, we're very lucky that we are very Christian. And so if he gets agitated and stuff, I tell the nursing staff, just do the Lord's Prayer with him, because I think that that's something that you never forget, because you're instilled with that at a young age. So he can still say the Lord's Prayer with us, you know? So it's a way that I can get him to talk and hear his voice, is starting that. So I just try to give little tips and things for the nursing home that they can do to help it a little bit better. And I'm so excited that we're part of the All FTD with Mayo Clinic, but it's also sad that I have to have the nursing home fill out those papers. How much does he sleep? What does he eat? It's like, how I want to be able to be the one to be able to do those, but I know I have to put the trust into them that they are that person now.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask, as FTD was advancing with Tommy and before he started to go into care facilities, was it just a change from care partner to caregiver, or was there a little bit of in and out as he was progressing? Do you remember?
I would say probably a little bit of in and out, because I didn't want to overstep his boundaries. Like, if he could do it for himself, I wanted him to do it for himself, because I didn't want to take away his ability to do things. And so I would, if he got agitated, I'd be like, okay, now let's go and let's write in the journal. You know, I think of different ways to maybe get his mind off of things. But if he didn't want to do that, then I'd be like, oh, well, go out to the shop and do something. So, I mean, it's just trying to give him different ideas, but I don't want to rule his world either. So.
Right. So let me ask you another question, and this is really about you as the care partner right now. As time has gone on, is that journey easier or harder for you, or is it just changed? And is that the other way to describe it?
I'll tell you, the best thing that I ever did for myself was read the book, I think it's called Ambiguous Loss. And it made me understand that I grieve all the time. Like, someday I'll be totally fine, and then the next day I'm grieving again. I know that if I don't see him within a month, I get very crabby, and I just have to be able to be there to see him. And so you're always on the journey of grieving to not grieving, to trying to figure out how you move on from here. At such a young age, you don't expect your loved one to be in a nursing home. And how do you equipped for a different world and a different life, because if he wouldn't have gotten sick and if he wouldn't have, we'd still be together today, but he's at his spot and I'm at my spot in my life now.
So as the care partner, what would be more person-centric for you going through the FTD journey? What would be helpful?
One thing that we need to do is we need to educate. And I know we've said this over and over again, but my vision and my dream would be we go in and at least get an hour or 2 hours for the physicians, the CNAs, the nursing staff, and let them know about young dementia. I think that we get labeled, they think they're going to be just older people that they're going to have to deal with. We need them to know these are walker talkers. These are guys that they might push through you. You have to learn you can't pull on them. You have to get in front of them so they see you in the eyes and you say, hey, you got to turn around. So we need to learn redirection. There's so many times that these behaviors don't even have to be done if you're trained properly. And that's where the number one thing we need to do. And we also need to get our physicians to know that this happens at a young age. And I think there's so many people that are not diagnosed. And in my heart, I feel that there's even people in jails that have FTD because they were doing behaviors that are not normal, but we don't have a term for them. And so I think a lot of people are getting lost in the cracks. And I just wish that we could get more education out there on what FTD is all about.
I think it's sorely needed. So Matt, you're in the disease advocacy world and very much at the forefront of educating healthcare professionals and families, other advocates. So the amount of disease advocacy work that you've done, I've always admired, and especially that when you're at AFTD, you started doing a parallel conference for persons diagnosed with FTD. It had always been the caregivers conference prior to that. So I was wondering two things. One, how different are those two sessions from each other? And the other one was, how difficult was it to convince everyone that this could and should be done?
Well, thank you. And it's been a really wonderful experience actually developing that part of our annual education conference. And I should say it really was started by people with FTD hearing about our conference and saying, well, wait a sec, what is there for me? How do I participate in this? And it was actually led by, you can say, one person named Howard Glick, who was responsible really for a lot of what AFTD is doing in terms of trying to include the voice of people with FTD in our work. But he basically demanded, for lack of a better word, that there at least be space given to people with FTD so that they could get together and talk to each other. And so the parallel track at our caregiver conference kind of started that way. It was almost like a support group that was led by people with FTD rather than a facilitator. And it worked that way for a couple of years. But I think naturally it developed into a model where it was less support group, more facilitated discussion. Again, led by people with FTD, determining what the topics were going to be and how they were going to be talked about. And it was really an opportunity for people with FTD to learn from each other as much as anything else. What I think it's going towards now is less of a parallel track and more of a sort of inclusive conference that incorporates sessions that are specifically for people with FTD, often developed and run by people with FTD, as well as sessions that are really meant to be mixed, where there's opportunities for conversation between two parts of that dyad, and where those perspectives can be brought forward from both sides on specific subjects. And then there are certainly sessions that really have to be, well, not have to be, but work better if they're designed and planned for one audience or another. And the best example of that is grief sessions about grief and advanced planning. The perspectives of the person living with the disease on grief is so very different than the perspective of the care partner. And unless you are very intentional about it, it's hard to have, a conversation about that. And so that's a good example of a subject that's really often treated as exclusive one way or the other. But it really is going more towards that model where AFTD is incorporating the perspective of people with FTD into the planning of the conference, not just in terms of the sessions, but also all aspects of the conference, like the physical layout of the venue and things like that, so that perspective is sort of baked into the conference from the very beginning. And it's just sort of an integral part of what we do every year. And at this point, it's really basically an expected aspect of our conference is that there will be this range of sessions that are going to be, advertised appropriately and more clearly. And to sort of an example of how much of an expected part of this is in our conference is that there's a group of people who totally on their own started planning a dinner that goes along with our conference. And so they make plans for to get a room in a restaurant, and they come every year, sort of the AFTD followers there, and they show up, and this dinner is such a wonderful event, and it's really a privilege to be a part of it. But that's grown up right alongside our conference, really, and I think that shows really how much we are. I mean, we still have work to do for sure, but how far it's come from those beginnings when it really was just kind of a room with chairs that we set aside so that people with FTD could at least talk to each other.
I think Thomas Kitwood would be proud. One final question, and this is really to all of you. It seems like disease advocacy groups and ambassadors like yourself, Deb, and genetic counselors like yourself, Jamie, who all make an effort to go above and beyond and really enhance and stimulate conversations about FTD and within the FTD community. Is the medical health profession up to speed with everything that we've heard today? Are they aware that there's so many persons diagnosed who have a voice, they want to be seen and heard, that caregivers are not just the informant in the room supplying details because the person diagnosed no longer can? And anybody who wants to jump in first, go ahead.
I'll say that my role there changes. I become the care fighter. I want these physicians to hear what's happening to my loved one. Sometimes I probably come overbearing at first, but he can't talk. And I've known him for so long. I know by his gestures, I know by his things, what he's thinking, what he needs. And so the physicians, I feel, well, I'm really lucky. I have some great darn physicians that take care of us, But what I try to do now also is send out packages to our small town hospitals and with information of FTD, so that if they have somebody like that come through, maybe that will spark something. Well, maybe this is more than just a midlife crisis. So I just feel like we have so much more to do, so much more work to talk about and get a lot of more people on board.
Yeah, exactly. Jamie.
Yeah, and I would echo what Deb said. I think certainly that, providers have come a long way in recognizing that the person with the diagnosis in front of them is more than just the diagnosis. I think that we all want to be treated with respect for our personhood, again, regardless of whether we're facing a diagnosis or caring for someone with a diagnosis or providing care or treating someone with a diagnosis. I do think that medicine could always do better to improve holistic thinking about people and health or illness, and to improve self-reflection on the impact of labels and designations that medical procedures and tests render, or the labels that affect people and their families. And that's what I love about World FTD Awareness Week. It's a chance to really highlight that this is kind of an under-messaged area that we could do more for families.
Sounds good. Matt, last word to you.
And I think I'm really excited about some of the work that's going on at AFTD, but elsewhere, directly related to the National Alzheimer's Project about how we talk about dementia, and not just FTD, but all forms of dementia, and trying to really look at that and reformulate it in a way that works for everybody. I think part of the problem is that different groups of people have different language, different terms they use, from researchers to clinical people to, family members and people living with a diagnosis. So I think there's going to be there needs to be more work done to make that a group conversation and start so that everybody's using the same language and the same terminology to talk about these diseases in a way that works for everybody, for sure. Because there's just still so much stigma that's become associated even with the term dementia itself. So that it really does need a reevaluation.
Thank you, everyone, for being so candid, but also providing such really thoughtful and creative ideas about how we could be more person-centered in FTD. Danielle, I'm going to turn it over for you to do the wrap-up.
Wonderful. So we have one last question for our panelists, and then we'll conclude today's discussion. And I'm going to start with you, Deb. What would you like to share after we've listened to the stories and the experiences and so much wisdom that's been shared on today's call? What is one key takeaway that you would like to share to conclude our discussion?
I would say my key takeaway today is we need to understand the people with behavioral FTD, they're still in there. And we have to talk to them. I always say that I can tell that Tommy sometimes goes into a dementia shell. But let me tell you, when I see his eyes brighten up and when I see him, I'm like, come out of that shell and you talk to me. We can't stop fighting for them. And so I want to say, get support. Definitely caregivers, we need the support. Find a support group, because I love being the support group facilitator, because we give each other ideas on this worked for me, this worked for that other person. And so I just want to give power to the caregivers to do more for their loved ones.
Thank you, Deb. Jamie, what is your key takeaway from today's conversation?
Yeah, so I want to go back to something that actually Matt said that really resonated with me. And Matt, you had said being intentional. And I think that being intentional about our consideration of people with the diagnosis of FTD for their care partners, their family members, I think only then can we truly see person-centered care. And I think that's something that I know World Awareness Week will highlight, but I think every individual has their story, every individual has their needs and desires and wishes, and we need to honor that as much as we can.
So Matt, you truly get the last word twice. So share with us what your key takeaway is.
I know so well how challenging this disease can be, not personally so much, but from talking to people from all over the country and how hard it is. But it's conversations kind of like this where people are sharing different perspectives on the disease, but sharing it together that gives me the most hope. And that is certainly part of what FTD Awareness Week is all about. But I know it goes on throughout the year, and these opportunities exist if you look for them. And it's always the other people that are going to be the greatest resource for you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Deb, for participating in today's discussion on FTD and sharing again your experiences, your journey, your personal stories. It's been time well spent and a privilege, as Nadine spoke to earlier on in the conversation. I also would like to thank those of you that are watching this recording, and we hope that you've enjoyed being part of the conversation on FTD. So thank you.
Thank you all. We're honored to have you as part of our conversation today.